Conyers, Georgia, January 13th, 2010. A quiet subdivision is shattered by the hysterical cries of two 16-year-old girls. They had just returned from high school to find a scene of unimaginable carnage. Their mother, 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead, lay dead in a pool of blood on the master bathroom floor. The sheer brutality of the ambush suggested a crime of deep personal rage. Investigators immediately began searching for a deranged intruder. Failing to realize the true architects of this slaughter were the two weeping identical twins standing right in front of them. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Before the yellow police tape sealed off the residence, Nikki Whitehead was simply a woman striving for the American dream. Born in 1975, she was thrust into adulthood prematurely when she gave birth to identical twin girls, Jasmia and Tasmia, at just 18 years old. Navigating the world as a single teenage mother with two infants was a monumental challenge. Yet Nikki refused to let her circumstances dictate her future. She possessed an innate hustle and a sharp eye for aesthetics, qualities that naturally drew her to the beauty industry. Nikki built a highly reputable career as a cosmetologist and salon worker in the Atlanta area. The environment suited her vibrant, outgoing personality perfectly. Surrounded by the constant buzzing hum of blow dryers and the sharp chemical scent of acrylic nails and hairspray, she transformed her clients while simultaneously rebuilding her own life. Her ambition was singular and unwavering, to provide her daughters with a standard of living she had always toiled for. By her early 30s, that relentless work ethic finally materialized into tangible success. She secured a beautiful, sprawling home in the Bridal Ridge subdivision of Conyers, a quiet, affluent suburban community located roughly 24 miles east of downtown Atlanta. With its manicured lawns and expansive two-story houses, it was the exact type of neighborhood that signified safety and upward mobility. In their early years, the trio was entirely inseparable. Nikki, Jasmia, and Tasmia operated as a tightly knit, fiercely loyal unit. The girls were a living reflection of their mother's dedication. As young children, the twins were frequently dressed in matching outfits, their hair meticulously styled, a walking, breathing testament to Nikki's professional skills and maternal pride. Friends and extended family members routinely noted that the mother and daughters often acted more like close sisters, sharing clothes, music, and an infectious, high-energy dynamic that lit up any room they entered. The girls themselves were remarkably gifted. Jasmia and Tasmia, affectionately known as Jazz and Tass, were not just identical in physical appearance. They mirrored each other's fierce intellect and drive. Throughout middle school, they were consistent honor roll students, effortlessly earning straight A's and participating heavily in various extracurricular activities, including Girl Scouts, choir, and competitive dance. They were polite, well-spoken, and deeply embedded in their local community. To the casual outside observer, the Whitehead household was a stunning triumph of single motherhood. However, the transition from a modest background to middle-class suburban comfort came with intense, underlying pressures. Nikki was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. She firmly believed that maintaining absolute, uncompromising control was the only viable way to keep her daughters safe from the pitfalls she had faced. She established rigid boundaries regarding their curfew, the specific styles of clothes they were allowed to wear, and the friends they were permitted to keep. For a long time, the girls respected this rigid structure. They thrived under her intense guidance, consistently producing the exceptional academic results Nikki demanded. Yet, as the twins approached mid-adolescence, the insular, protected world the three of them had built began to fracture. Jazz and Taz rapidly developed their own distinct personalities, despite their identical physical features. They started fiercely craving personal autonomy. The matching dresses were discarded in favor of individual styles, and the once harmonious household slowly gave way to the inevitable friction of teenage rebellion. Nikki's romantic life also introduced a complicated new dynamic. She had been seriously dating a truck driver named Robert Head. Robert provided genuine emotional and financial stability, and he cared deeply for the girls. But his physical presence in the 2,500 square foot house shifted the delicate balance of the trio. The twins, accustomed to having their mother's undivided attention and sharing a somewhat horizontal power structure with her, suddenly found themselves subjected to the rules of a traditional two-parent household hierarchy. What began as typical teenage pushback, eye-rolling, missed curfews, and slammed bedroom doors soon mutated into something entirely different. The strict parameters Nikki had established out of love to protect her daughters were now perceived by the 16-year-olds as a suffocating, intolerable prison. The vibrant, loving home in Conyers was quietly setting the stage for a devastating psychological war. The teenage years introduced a highly volatile element into the Bridal Ridge residence. Jazz and Tass, once straight-A students and the pride of their mother's life, began to deliberately sabotage their academic records and their household standing. They skipped classes, forged report cards to hide failing grades, and openly flaunted their disobedience. Nikki responded the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip. She confiscated their cell phones, grounded them for weeks at a time, and locked away their favorite clothes. But these traditional disciplinary tactics, which might have worked on a single child, completely backfired against an identical duo. The twins operated as a synchronized front. They functioned as a psychological echo chamber. When one felt slighted, the other immediately amplified the grievance, forming an impenetrable, unified wall of defiance against their mother. The introduction of Robert Head into the daily routine only accelerated the collapse. The girls viewed Nikki's boyfriend as an illegitimate authority figure invading their territory. They openly mocked his attempts to mediate disputes, making it unequivocally clear they considered the 2,500 square foot house to belong solely to them and their mother. Arguments rapidly evolved from standard shouting matches into terrifying physical confrontations. The neighbors, who had once admired the beautifully manicured property, now frequently saw patrol cars idling in the driveway. Nikki began calling the local sheriff's department just to maintain basic order, using law enforcement as an improvised parenting tool. The twins, sharp and calculating, quickly learned how to weaponize that same system against her. The breaking point occurred in the summer of 2008. A mundane dispute over chores and curfew ignited into a violent brawl in the living room. Nikki, physically overwhelmed by two athletic, growing teenagers, fought back desperately to defend herself. When the police arrived, the girls immediately altered their demeanor. They played the victims flawlessly, pointing to superficial scratch marks and claiming their mother had attacked them unprovoked. Officers noted that the 16-year-olds were alarmingly calm, while Nikki was frantic and hysterical. Based on the physical marks, Nikki was arrested and temporarily charged with domestic battery, a devastating humiliation for a woman who had sacrificed her youth to build a life for her children. Although the charges were ultimately dropped, the psychological damage was absolute. The mother-daughter bond was entirely severed, replaced by cold, calculated hostility. Following the arrest, juvenile court authorities intervened, determining that the household was too toxic for the teenagers. Custody was temporarily granted to the girls' great-grandmother, Della Frazier, who lived a few miles away. For Jasmia and Tasmia, this was a massive, intoxicating victory. Della's home offered a far more lenient environment. The strict curfews evaporated, the rigid rules dissolved, and the twins tasted the absolute freedom they had been violently fighting for. They attended a different high school, partied with older crowds, and practically erased Nikki from their daily lives. But Nikki refused to let her daughters derail their futures. She genuinely believed Della's leniency was a direct path to delinquency and ruin. She spent the next 18 months fighting a grueling legal battle to regain custody. She attended mandatory counseling, completed anger management and parenting classes, and adjusted her work schedule to meet every single court requirement. She was determined to bring her girls back under her roof, convinced that her strict love was the only thing standing between them and total failure. The twins, meanwhile, actively fought against returning. They explicitly told court-appointed counselors they hated their mother, stating clearly that they would do whatever it took to stay away from her. The psychologists noted the girls' deep-seated anger, but fundamentally miscalculated its deadly potential, dismissing it as severe teenage angst. The legal system, prioritizing family reunification above all else, ignored the twins' warnings. On January 5, 2010, a juvenile court judge made a fatal ruling. Declaring that Nikki had met all the state's demands and proven herself a capable parent, the court officially terminated Della Frazier's temporary custody. Jasmia and Tasmia were ordered to pack their bags and return to the Conyers subdivision immediately. The girls were absolutely devastated. They sat in the courtroom with their arms crossed, staring daggers at their mother, viewing the court order as a death sentence to their social lives. When the twins walked back into the two-story house that afternoon, the atmosphere was instantly suffocating. Nikki had won the legal war, but the enemy was now living inside her walls. The girls completely refused to speak to her. They communicated through icy glares and slammed doors, treating their mother like a hostile warden. Nikki, attempting to re-establish her dominance, immediately laid out a strict new set of rules, demanding perfect attendance at school and a complete cessation of their rebellious behavior. She drew a hard line in the sand, completely unaware that her daughters had already decided to cross it. The house went ominously quiet for 8 days. The countdown to January 13th had officially begun. The morning of Wednesday, January 13th, 2010. The sun had not yet crested the horizon over Conyers, leaving the Bridal Ridge subdivision bathed in a cold, pre-dawn gray. Outside, the temperature hovered at a bitter 32 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing the dew on the manicured lawns. Inside the 2,500 square foot house, the environment was infinitely colder. The 8 days of forced cohabitation had culminated in a suffocating psychological pressure cooker. Nikki Whitehead was already awake, dressed, and moving through the house. She had a busy schedule ahead, including errands and a hair appointment. The twins, Jasmia and Tasmia, were meant to be preparing for another day at Rockdale County High School. Instead, they remained barricaded in their bedrooms, their alarm clocks ignored, actively staging a silent protest against their mother's newly reinstated authority. Nikki refused to let the insubordination slide. She marched down the carpeted hallway, rapping sharply on their doors, demanding they get up and get dressed. The response was a heavy, defiant silence. When the 16-year-olds finally emerged from their rooms, there was no typical teenage grogginess, no sluggish shuffling. They were fully alert. They moved with a rigid, synchronized hostility, their identical faces set in matching expressions of deep contempt. They bypassed their mother entirely, walking into the kitchen. The kitchen, a sprawling space defined by polished granite countertops, light oak cabinetry, and light-colored linoleum flooring, was about to transform from the heart of the home into a slaughterhouse. Nikki followed them into the room, refusing to back down. She stood near the center island, demanding basic respect and outlining the severe consequences of their ongoing rebellion. She made it explicitly clear that she would not hesitate to contact juvenile authorities again. She threatened to have law enforcement drag them out of the house and label them as legally uncontrollable if they did not submit to her rules. For Jasmia and Tasmia, this was the ultimate trigger. Returning to the strict confines of the court system, or facing juvenile detention, meant the permanent death of the freedom they had tasted at their great-grandmother's house. They did not scream. They did not throw a typical adolescent tantrum. Instead, they formed a solid physical wall in front of the lower cabinets. They verbally dismantled their mother, mocking her authority, their voices overlapping and amplifying each other into a singular, impenetrable wall of defiance. The argument rapidly breached the threshold of verbal hostility. The twins began to subtly shift their positions. They used their identical, athletic frames to box their mother in, cutting off her exit paths toward the carpeted living room. Nikki recognized the tactical shift. The standard maternal frustration evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sudden, freezing spike of genuine terror. She was a 34-year-old woman weighing barely 130 pounds. She was entirely trapped by two younger, stronger adversaries. She reached for the phone, intending to dial emergency services to defuse the escalating nightmare. The ambush commenced without a single warning cry. A heavy ceramic pot resting on the granite counter was weaponized. A sudden, violent swing. A devastating impact against Nikki's skull. The hollow, sickening crack of bone. Shattered ceramic exploded outward. Shards skittered across the linoleum, sliding under the refrigerator. Nikki staggered backward. Her vision fractured. She lost her footing. The twins swarmed, No hesitation, no mercy. They tackled their mother to the hard floor. The physical assault was blindingly fast, brutal, unrelenting. Heavy blows rained down on Nikki's face, brutal kicks to her ribs. The 130-pound woman fought back with the absolute primal adrenaline of survival. She clawed frantically at their faces. She sank her teeth deep into exposed forearms, tearing at the skin. She ripped at their hair, desperately trying to create an inch of breathing room. She was fighting a war against the very bodies she had carried and birthed. The mathematics of the ambush were impossible to overcome. Two relentless attackers against one disoriented, bleeding victim. They pinned her thrashing arms. They smothered her desperate cries for help. A hand reached up to the wooden knife block resting near the sink, the sharp, metallic scrape of steel being drawn from its slot. The violence shifted instantly from a vicious beating to a calculated execution. The blade descended, again and again. The sickening sound of metal tearing through fabric and flesh. Punctures to the chest. Deep, jagged lacerations to the neck. The sheer volume of strikes, dozens of individual stab wounds, indicated a complete psychological rupture, a dam of hatred bursting. Blood sprayed in wide arcs across the pristine white lower cabinets. It pooled thick and dark, filling the grout lines of the floor. The heavy metallic scent of copper completely saturated the air, choking the room. Nikki slipped in her own blood, choking, gasping for air. But the struggle did not end in the kitchen. Bleeding profusely, Nikki managed to drag her battered body toward the hallway. She crawled on her hands and knees. She left thick, smeared handprints on the white baseboards, fighting for every inch of distance. The twins followed at a walking pace. They reached down and grabbed her by the ankles. They yanked her backward. A wide, horrifying trail of crimson painted the beige carpet, soaking deep into the fibers. They hauled her dead weight through the hallway, the friction burning against the floor. They dragged her over the threshold and into the master bathroom. The cold tile offered no sanctuary. The twins stood over her, breathing heavily, watching with cold detachment as their mother took her final, ragged, agonizing breaths. Her chest hitched one last time. It stopped moving. The bathroom went dead silent. The erratic, heavy panting of the 16-year-olds echoed sharply against the vanity mirrors. They looked down at the mutilated corpse on the tiles. There was no sudden realization of horror. There was no hysterical sobbing. There was no frantic call for an ambulance. Instead, Jasmia and Tasmia instantly initiated a chilling, synchronized cleanup protocol. They walked back down the hallway, their shoes leaving sticky, red footprints on the carpet. They returned to the kitchen. The space looked like an active war zone. They retrieved heavy-duty cleaning supplies from beneath the sink. The sharp, caustic chemical burn of bleach quickly overpowered the heavy, metallic smell of death. They poured the liquid directly onto the linoleum. They used kitchen towels to violently scrub the thickest pools of blood, but the effort was entirely futile. The blood had already seeped into the porous surfaces. It had soaked permanently into the carpet padding in the hallway. The sheer volume of the mess made sanitization impossible. Realizing they could not erase the crime scene, they pivoted to self-preservation. They stripped off their blood-soaked pajamas. They stuffed the ruined clothes, the shattered ceramic pieces, the murder weapons, and the saturated towels into heavy plastic garbage bags. They stepped into the showers. They watched the water run pink, then dark red, swirling down the drain as they washed their mother's DNA from their skin and hair. They scrubbed the dried flakes of blood from under their fingernails. They stood side by side before the fogged mirrors. They applied thick layers of foundation and concealer, meticulously masking the deep, stinging scratch marks and bite bruises Nikki had carved into their cheeks, necks, and arms during her desperate final defense. They flat-ironed their hair. They opened their closets and selected fashionable, pristine outfits. They sprayed heavy perfumes to neutralize any lingering scent of the bleach or the copper tang of blood. The morning sun was now fully up, casting bright beams through the windows of the silent house. The biological clock of the school day was demanding their presence. They needed an airtight alibi. The twins grabbed their backpacks, heavy with textbooks and unfinished homework. They walked out the front door, stepping into the freezing January air. They pulled the door shut, engaging the heavy deadbolt behind them. The house was successfully locked down like a suburban tomb. containing the butchered remains of their mother on the bathroom floor. Jasmia and Tasmaya walked down the manicured sidewalk of the Bridal Ridge subdivision. They boarded the yellow school bus with the rest of the neighborhood kids. They rode the 20 miles to Rockdale County High School. They walked the crowded, noisy hallways, blending flawlessly into the massive stream of teenagers. They sat at their assigned desks. They took notes in class. They ate lunch in the cafeteria. They chatted casually with their peers about upcoming weekend plans and pop culture. For 8 solid hours, the 16-year-olds executed a perfect, chilling performance of mundane, everyday life, a meticulously manufactured alibi running precisely on schedule, while the ultimate horror waited silently for them back home. At 3:15 p.m., the heavy yellow Rockdale County school bus rumbled back into the Bridal Ridge subdivision, breaking the afternoon silence. The air brakes hissed loudly, the folding doors swung open, and Jasmia and Tasmia stepped out into the crisp 40-degree Fahrenheit air. They walked the remaining few hundred feet to their house, their heavy backpacks slung over their shoulders. To the neighbors glancing out their front windows, it was a perfectly mundane suburban tableau. The twins were chatting casually, their pristine outfits completely spotless, their hair meticulously flat-ironed. They walked up the wide concrete driveway, retrieved their keys, and unlocked the heavy front door. The performance began the absolute second the deadbolt clicked. They did not need to search the sprawling 2,500 square foot house to know what waited inside. The sensory assault was immediate and overwhelming. The stifling air trapped inside the residence was saturated with the caustic, burning fumes of industrial bleach, layered sickeningly over the dense, heavy copper scent of coagulated blood. The 16-year-olds dropped their backpacks in the tiled entryway. They lingered inside just long enough to establish a plausible timeline for their alibi of discovery, then bolted back out the front door, leaving it wide open to the freezing January wind. They ran out onto the manicured lawn, their arms flailing, their voices tearing through the quiet neighborhood. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy happened to be actively patrolling the subdivision, his cruiser rolling slowly down the street on a routine sweep. The twins sprinted directly toward the heavy 2-ton vehicle, frantically waving their arms and pointing back at the open door of their home. They effectively forced the deputy to slam on his brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the cold asphalt. The girls collapsed onto the street, hyperventilating, tearing at their pristine clothes, and wailing incoherently that something terrible had happened to their mother. The deputy instantly switched into tactical mode. He radioed dispatch for emergency backup, drew his standard-issue sidearm, and approached the open residence. The teenagers remained on the front lawn, executing a flawless, synchronized display of hysterical, blinding grief. The officer crossed the threshold. The environment inside was completely surreal. The house was dead silent, but the physical destruction spoke of absolute chaos. The deputy's eyes immediately locked onto the kitchen. The polished granite countertops were smeared with dark crimson arcs. The light-colored linoleum was completely covered in a horrific, slippery mixture of thick blood and foaming bleach. Shattered pieces of a heavy ceramic pot were scattered across the floor, mixed with overturned chairs and completely ruined kitchen towels. The sheer volume of blood suggested a frantic, prolonged struggle. The violence had clearly not been contained to the kitchen space. The deputy followed the gruesome trail deeper into the house. Wide, dark drag marks painted a terrifying path down the hallway, soaking deep into the beige carpet fibers. Smeared, bloody handprints marred the white baseboards, a desperate visual record of a woman fighting for her life while being hauled across the floor by a superior force. The officer moved slowly, his weapon raised, checking the corners of the hallway for any lingering threat. The trail ended abruptly at the threshold of the master bathroom. He stepped into the doorway and looked down at the cold tile. Nikki Whitehead lay motionless in an expansive pool of blood. The sheer brutality of the trauma was staggering. Her torso and neck were riddled with dozens of deep puncture wounds and jagged lacerations. Her face was heavily bruised, her ribs visibly crushed from heavy impacts. The extensive defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had fought her attackers with everything she had, right until her final breath. The deputy quickly checked for a pulse, but the 34-year-old woman was completely cold. The blood pooling in the grout lines had already begun to separate and dry. There was absolutely nothing paramedics could do. The officer immediately backed out of the bathroom, careful not to step on the bloody drag marks, and secured the interior perimeter. He radioed dispatch, confirming a brutal homicide and requesting crime scene technicians and lead detectives immediately. Outside, the situation was rapidly escalating into a public spectacle. The piercing wails of the twins had drawn the attention of the entire Bridal Ridge community. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, pulling their jackets tight against the chill, their faces pale with shock. Rumors ignited instantly and spread like wildfire. A home invasion, a targeted hit, a deranged burglar roaming the affluent streets of Conyers. The social echo was immediate and terrifying. If a hardworking mother could be butchered in broad daylight inside her locked, securely alarmed home, nobody in the subdivision was safe. Additional patrol cars swarmed the quiet street, their sirens cutting sharply through the winter air, their red and blue lights flashing violently against the brick facades of the neighboring houses. Paramedics arrived and immediately rushed to the 16-year-olds. Jasmia and Tasmia were wrapped in thick thermal blankets, shivering violently, tears streaming endlessly down their meticulously made-up faces. They leaned heavily on each other, sobbing uncontrollably into each other's shoulders, their performance of trauma absolutely unbreakable. When the lead homicide detectives arrived on the scene, their first instinct was absolute sympathy. They looked at the two beautiful, honor roll students weeping on the lawn and saw only profound tragedy. The investigators gently guided the girls to the back of an idling ambulance to keep them warm. The detectives spoke to them in soft, comforting tones, promising the grieving daughters that they would not rest until they found the monster who had slaughtered their mother, completely blind to the fact that they were offering comfort to the very architects of the slaughter. The homicide unit immediately locked onto the most statistically probable suspect in any domestic murder, the romantic partner. The sheer volume of puncture wounds and the intimate, close-quarters nature of the assault heavily suggested a crime of deep, personal passion, rather than a random burglary gone wrong. Detectives brought Robert Head into the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room. The trucker was subjected to hours of grueling, methodical questioning. Investigators pressed him hard regarding his relationship timeline, recent domestic arguments, and his precise whereabouts on that freezing Wednesday morning. He was informed that his presence in the house was a known point of friction. However, the boyfriend's alibi proved absolutely ironclad. Commercial trucking logs, satellite GPS data from his rig, and multiple third-party witness statements placed him securely behind the wheel, hundreds of miles away on an interstate highway when the fatal blows were struck. He was completely cleared. With the primary person of interest eliminated, investigators pivoted to the neighborhood rumor mill. The affluent subdivision was rapidly engulfed in paranoia. Residents flooded the tip lines, reporting suspicious vehicles and demanding increased patrols, terrified of a violent home invasion crew targeting suburban residences. But the physical evidence at the crime scene stubbornly contradicted the burglary theory. Crime scene technicians noted that the front door's heavy deadbolt had been engaged from the inside. There were no shattered windows, no pried hinges, and no muddy boot prints leading from the backyard. The victim's purse, credit cards, and expensive jewelry remained completely untouched on the bedroom dresser. The killers had not come to steal. They had come specifically to butcher. The investigative midpoint pivot occurred during a routine follow-up interview. Detectives needed to clarify the timeline with the only two surviving residents. While sitting across from the teenagers in the precinct, a seasoned investigator noticed a glaring visual anomaly. The girls were wearing an unusually thick, heavy layer of liquid foundation and thick concealer, not just on their faces, but slathered across their necks, forearms, and the backs of their hands. The cosmetic application was entirely inconsistent with typical adolescent makeup trends. It looked like heavy theatrical camouflage. The detective politely but firmly requested that the girls wipe their arms clean with a damp cloth. The fabricated narrative of a mysterious intruder began to disintegrate the absolute moment the makeup was removed. Beneath the thick cosmetics were severe, raw lacerations, deep, parallel scratch marks tracked violently down their cheeks and necks. Jagged, dark purple bruises, unmistakably shaped like human dental arches, marred their forearms. When pressed by law enforcement to explain the fresh injuries, the siblings offered a remarkably clumsy, uncoordinated excuse. They claimed they had been involved in a minor, meaningless physical altercation with a rival peer at school a few days prior. The detectives knew instantly that a standard high school shoving match did not produce desperate, defensive bite wounds. The teenagers were immediately separated and escorted into different windowless interrogation rooms. Stripped of their psychological echo chamber and their ability to synchronize their reactions, the identical duo was forced to navigate the intense police questioning entirely alone. Investigators employed classic high-pressure interrogation tactics. They systematically dismantled the school fight excuse, noting that the campus resource officer had no record of any such incident. They attempted to play the sisters against each other, indirectly suggesting that one sibling was already in the process of trading a full confession for a lighter juvenile sentence. The officers observed a chilling behavioral shift. The hysterical, hyperventilating weeping that the girls had performed so flawlessly on the front lawn completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of calculating defiance. They sat rigid in their metal chairs. They strictly maintained that they had walked in at 3:15 p.m. and discovered the horrific aftermath. They insisted they had absolutely no knowledge of how their mother had met her end, casually dismissing the deep gouges in their own skin as completely unrelated to the homicide. Lacking the definitive forensic proof required to charge two minors with first-degree murder, law enforcement had no choice but to release them. But they did not let them leave empty-handed. Detectives secured comprehensive search warrants for the daughters' physical persons. Forensic technicians meticulously swabbed the bruised bite marks on their arms for trace saliva. They scraped the tissue from beneath their manicured fingernails. They confiscated the stylish, pristine outfits and shoes they had worn to school that day. The investigation then entered the most agonizing, frustrating phase for any homicide detective: the silent, administrative wait for the state crime lab. Because of massive administrative backlogs, the testing process dragged on for months. During this excruciating interim, the twins moved back in with their great-grandmother. They attended classes, passed their exams, went to spring social events, and effectively walked free, living a completely normal teenage existence while the community remained paralyzed by the fear of a phantom killer. The detectives watched them closely, building a quiet, inescapable trap. In late May, the State Crime Laboratory finally delivered the comprehensive forensic report. The biological mathematics were absolute and devastating. The DNA profile extracted from the deep, torn epidermal tissue found beneath the victim's fingernails was a flawless, undeniable match to her daughter's. The microscopic traces of saliva swabbed from the bruised bite marks on the teenager's forearms perfectly matched the victim's dental records. Furthermore, forensic analysis of the plumbing in the house's bathrooms revealed heavy, concentrated pools of the victim's blood trapped in the P-traps of the shower drains, proving beyond a doubt that the killers had bathed on site to wash away the evidence. The final, fatal blow to their alibi came from the girls' confiscated footwear. Technicians discovered microscopic, high-velocity blood spatter on the soles and laces of the shoes they had worn to school, spatter that could only have been deposited by standing directly over a human body during a violent arterial assault. The meticulously constructed narrative of an afternoon discovery was completely annihilated. The timeline was definitively rewritten by the science. The evidence proved that the fatal ambush occurred in the early morning hours, long before the yellow school bus ever arrived. The grieving daughters were not the tragic, traumatized survivors of a random home invasion. They were the cold-blooded architects of their own mother's slaughter. The subsequent arrests were executed swiftly in late June. Law enforcement located the siblings at different residences, one remaining at the great-grandmother's property, the other visiting a friend, and officially took them into custody. Due to the calculated, exceptionally brutal nature of the ambush, the prosecutor's office elected to try the teenagers as adults, effectively exposing them to the absolute maximum penalties under the law. They remained entirely steadfast in their denial for over 3 years, languishing in a county detention center while awaiting trial. The unified wall of defiance only began to crumble when the overwhelming weight of the forensic evidence was systematically laid out during pre-trial hearings. Specifically, the microscopic blood spatter and the DNA extracted from under the victim's fingernails. Realizing the state possessed an airtight narrative built entirely on their own biological markers, the psychological echo chamber finally collapsed. In early 2014, to avoid the absolute certainty of a drawn-out, highly publicized trial and a potential life sentence without the possibility of parole, the sisters accepted a plea agreement. They officially pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and related criminal charges. The presiding judge sentenced both individuals to serve 30 years in a state penitentiary. Their admissions of guilt in the courtroom were delivered with chilling detachment, offering only cold, tactical concessions to the overwhelming biological facts presented against them, rather than any genuine expression of remorse. The Bridle Ridge subdivision eventually returned to its quiet routines, yet a permanent, heavy shadow lingered over the pristine lawns. The community never truly recovered from the psychological shock that the ultimate threat came from inside a locked, heavily alarmed home. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead fought a brutal, escalating war for teenage autonomy, viewing their mother's strict love as an intolerable prison. In their chilling pursuit of absolute freedom, they executed a calculated slaughter, ultimately securing themselves 3 decades inside a literal cage. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.